In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on dimensions of identity and difference, and developing a vocabulary through which we can understand the way that dimensions of identity and difference co-construct each other in granting privilege to some and disadvantage and injury to others. So in this lecture, we're going to touch on the 5 key dimensions of identity and difference that we'll be focusing on in this class: race, class, gender, sexuality, and nation. And as we think about these together, we'll then be thinking about the theory of intersectionality to understand them in conversation with one another. So for each of these dimensions of identity and difference, each slide will have 2 definitions. The first refers to kind of the surface manifestation of identity and difference, the way that it appears to us in everyday life. The second one focuses on the sort of cultural and political work that each of these dimensions of identity and difference do, the way that identity and difference in particular relates to issues of oppression. So first up is race. Race we can understand as the culturally specific classification of bodies based on phenotype. So then here we're thinking about those sort of bodily features that we use to tell if a person belongs to one race or another. For example, hair color, hair texture, skin color. And as we think about the way that racism works, we'd be thinking about race as a category related to our own proximity, our group experience of, on the one hand, racial privilege, and on the other hand, premature death. And as such, we're focusing on the material consequences of race and racism. Next up is class. Class we can define broadly as our relationship to financial and cultural capital. Right? Capital referring, of course, to resources that have value. So we know what financial capital means. That refers a lot to, for example, salary, wealth, savings. But as we think about cultural capital, we're thinking about those aspects of culture that we associate with refinement, education, and sophistication. Or in other words, we'd be thinking about those intangible ways that come to appear like we have a lot of financial capital at our disposal. For example, having a quality college degree doesn't just open up avenues for increased financial earning, it also is a way of expressing cultural capital through our education. And as we think about how class comes to matter in a larger picture, beyond our identities and our possessions, we'd be thinking about how class refers to our value within these larger capitalist hierarchies. Things come to have value because something else is seen as having less value. Our third category of identity and difference is gender. So gender we can broadly understand as the cultural classification of practices, of bodies, based on the sorts of bodily features that we come to associate with them. Or to be more crass, we'd be thinking about masculinity and femininity and the way that they get defined in relation to, for example, genitals. As we think about how gender and sexism continue to matter, we'd be thinking about how gender relates to the distribution of labor and agency. So for example, which gendered bodies do what sort of work? Which ones are not allowed to do that work? Who is allowed to make choices? And who turns out to be less able to make those same choices? Fourthly, we'll be focusing on sexuality. Sexuality comes to us as the real and imagined acts of desire and pleasure. So in talking about sexuality is not the same as sexual orientation, although sexual orientation and sexual identity are important ways that we understand our sexuality. So we'd be thinking about who we desire, what sorts of pleasure that we pursue, when we deem that appropriate, when we deem that inappropriate. We'd be thinking about the sorts of value that we place on certain types of relationships and certain types of pleasure. All of these fall under the broad umbrella of sexuality. But as we think about how sexuality continues to matter, we'd be thinking about how sexuality relates to our forms of social organization and how we use those to reproduce the normal. So we'd be thinking about how something as intimate as, for example, sexual intercourse becomes very much part of our public values and our public language. At this deep level, we'd be thinking about, for example, why do we continue to privilege the nuclear family as the most appropriate form of social organization? And fifthly, we'll be focusing on nation as a category of identity and difference. So at the surface level, we'd be thinking about nation in terms of nationality. how nation refers to formal and cultural processes of belonging, and how we imagine ourselves as belonging to this community that comes to exist because of our relationship to borders. So for example, we'd be thinking about nation in terms of our US citizenship, whether we have it or not. But at a deeper level, as we think about how citizenship matters, we'd be thinking about how nation as a category of identity and difference refers to how our lives are regulated according to the sort of bureaucratic power that's given to, for example, governments, and the way that borders do and continue to matter. So as we think about these 5 different categories of identity and difference, we're using the theory of intersectionality. Intersectionality refers to the co-construction of multiple dimensions of identity and difference in ways that reflect and shape individual experience according to social structures and cultural systems, and vice versa. So to explain it, we have this diagram. At the center of this diagram is you, as the individual member of this culture and society. At a larger level are these cultural systems that shape how we understand ourselves. And at an even larger level, we can be thinking about the social structure, the sum total of organizations and institutions that come to shape the way that we live our everyday lives. And cutting across this large level of the social structure and this very small unit of us are these different dimensions of identity and difference, right? So race and the way we experience it connects outward to the way that race works in the social structure. At the same time, for example, large gender stereotypes that exist in culture impact our individual experience in our everyday lives. So this becomes particularly important for this class because, for example, we'll be focusing a lot on dominant stereotypes that exist in popular culture. So for example, let's take the stereotype of the Asian American nerd. The Asian American man who is emasculated and is seen as being particularly dorky. So in order to contest that stereotype, maybe someone creates a film that stars a strong, very masculine Asian American protagonist. On the one hand, that contests some historical racial stereotypes. On the other hand, that way of contesting those stereotypes becomes a way of supporting gender norms and supporting forms of sexism, right? So we'd be thinking about how race relates to these different forms of identity and difference, and in fact is constructed through them. So we'll be talking more about intersectionality and these dimensions of identity and difference as we go through the course. We'll go more in depth into these definitions, but this will be sort of the starting point for the rest of our summer discussion.